Now we're ready to take that pattern of image preparation and revision to the broadest level of abstraction. We can address one of the game's most important thematic concerns, the ecology of human settlements that arise in the wake of societal collapse. I'm going to use the term human ecology, which might sound a little strange, so let's give it a definition. A human ecology is the sum total of all the characteristics of a human community rebuilt after the cordyceps devastation. The Last of Us is about Joel and Ellie's journey, yet we discover different human ecologies as we pass through various settlements along the way. The variety of these human ecologies explore one of the deepest themes in The Last of Us. That theme is a vision of the individual and collective human condition that we can choose to accept as plausible or that we can reject. This is, in my opinion, the marrow of the game. Structural analysis on its most abstract level reveals how the game explores these ideas. In terms of image preparation and revision, we've been looking at literal images and scenarios. When we abstract that pattern outward, we find that the game prepares and revises recurring ideas. So, here are the 6 recurring ideas we'll look at. First, each settlement's form of government. Second, the roles of women in each society. Third, the types of culture and the levels of technology. Fourth, the different portrayals of family and kinship. Fifth, the importance of children in each group. And finally, we'll examine each group's attitude toward the disposal of the dead. And we'll close out by looking at how these recurring ideas are represented in the 2 most idealized societies presented in The Last of Us: the sewer village outside Pittsburgh and Maria's settlement. Let's define government first. A government is the setup of power relationships between individuals and groups within a given society, however formal or informal that setup might be. We start in Boston. As we've seen that Boston has 2 economies, Boston has 2 governments, the military as the first and the underworld as the other. We'll look at the military first. We encounter 2 clearly divided classes of individuals, soldiers and civilians. The soldier class has power over and contempt for the non-soldier class.
Any straggler even looks at me the wrong way, I put his ass down.
The soldier class has no restriction on spontaneous lethal force.
Step back! Don't try that again.
We see this here as Joel walks too close to a guard twice.
Shit.
Basically, they're bullies. The Boston military also enforces a nightly curfew.
Attention! Curfew is now in full effect. Anyone caught outside without proper authorization will be arrested and prosecuted.
The military government justifies this in 2 ways. The first justification is to protect the quarantine zone against the infected, ostensibly to prevent them from becoming too strong and turning into bloaters. As we see here, they purposefully pursue infected that show signs of later, more dangerous stages of development. As part of that policy, they police abandoned buildings within the quarantine zones, since these buildings provide access to the outside, in the manner that Joel and Tess use after the Firefly attack at Gate 5. They will, therefore, prosecute anyone who doesn't obey strict zoning laws, whom they call stragglers.
Hey, Jesus.
Get down. Hands on your fucking head. Do it. Alright, scan them.
Once they've located stragglers, the military checks for infection and punishes those caught accordingly.
Get a live one.
No. I'm not infected.
Hold her down.
Do it.
Please.
Eyes forward.
They make public examples of anyone caught in unauthorized areas.
Fuck this! Holy shit!
Shut up. Consider yourself lucky. That's what happens when you hide out in a condemned building. Call the cleanup crew.
We're through here. Gonna need 2 bags and 2 more for the box.
All right, people, this isn't a show. Keep moving along.
While keeping the area safe from the infected, the military maintains a strong hand against the populace. These methods resemble how they handle the Fireflies.
I meant to tell you, I was down on Jordan Street, and all these soldiers showed up with a group of about 5 civs, all in handcuffs.
Let me guess. Fireflies?
Yep. They lined them up against the wall, and bang, bang, bang. They just executed all of them.
Shit.
Yeah, I hear it's like that all over the city. They're cracking down on them hard.
I gotta cut.
The government treats the Fireflies as criminals. And when they encounter Fireflies, they judge and use lethal force on sight.
What happened?
Fireflies. Same thing's gonna happen to us if we don't get off the street.
Soldiers will also violate civilians' homes based on suspicion alone.
What's up, Joel?
Eddie.
You hear they took Marianne?
What happened?
Came and snatched her in the middle of the night. Said she was a Firefly. You believe that shit?
Better not mention the Fireflies too loudly. You don't want the wrong person hearing you.
Yeah, you're probably right.
In Boston, suspicion of collusion with the Fireflies is proof. So to sum up, the Boston military abuses its organization and technology to terrorize and maintain control over the quarantine zone residents.
Don't try that again.
The other government relates to the black market. Unlike the military establishment, this government has a face: Roberts.
There's our boy.
Roberts' power as an underworld coordinator establishes a sub-government, much as the black market establishes a sub-economy for ration cards. Testament to his power is the fact that smugglers in his organization will obey orders and take jobs they'd rather not, on his word alone.
Jesus. We shouldn't have taken this job.
Not our call.
However, that word is ultimately empty. As Tess says, Boston presents two types of governments that we'll encounter throughout the game. First, governments whose leaders we never meet and whose underlings we must endure. Second, governments whose leaders have faces and with whom Joel and Ellie must deal. Next up is Billstown. We started in a context with a complex mix of players, including a well-organized authoritarian military regime. The Last of Us immediately dials that back to the government of a lone survivalist.
Let's get on with it.
The game dramatically and indirectly communicates how different Billstown is from Boston right from the start as we watch Ellie enjoy her first moments in a wooded environment.
Nothing, it's just... I've never seen anything like this, that's all.
You mean the woods?
Yeah. Never walked in the woods. It's kinda cool.
Now, the image of Ellie in a wooded area will return at a later time. Let's just bookmark this moment for now. So let's get back on point. The Last of Us communicates the difference in Billstown's governance through image preparation and revision here. Back in Boston, Joel, Tess, and Ellie were caught as stragglers and subjected to infection tests. The process was orderly.
Put your hands on your head.
The officers called for backup.
This is Ramirez at Sector 12, requesting pickup for 3 stragglers.
Ellie's infection was detected.
Why the hell are we smuggling an infected girl?
And our heroes escaped after Ellie stealthily stabbed one of the patrol officers with her switchblade. The Last of Us revises this image in Billstown, again with ironic reversals. The differences between the prepared and revised images tell us a bit about the different governments. First off, Ellie and Joel are again held captive.
Hey, what are you... Joel?
Bill!
What are you doing?
Bill!
Let me go.
Turn around and get on your knees.
Just calm down a second.
Turn around.
All right.
Get on your knees. Don't test me. Just...
Joel is forced into the same prone position as before as Bill checks for bites. We've got 2 major revisions here. First, Bill doesn't have the technology to gauge infection. He can only look for external signs.
Any bites? No. Anything sprouting?
God damn it, I'm clean!
Next, Bill knows Joel personally, which changes the nature of the interaction,
Turn around, on your knees.
despite the use of the same language. Second, Bill operates off improvisation.
Turn around and get on your knees.
Just calm down a second.
He actually loses control of the situation because of this.
Take it easy.
Any bites?
Oh.
Anything?
I mean, Ellie's not exactly being subtle back there.
See so much as a twitch. Ow! Stop! Son of a bitch!
Compare that with her stealth when she stabbed the Boston soldier with her switchblade. Bill is a lone survivalist, so no one has his back when Ellie and Joel confront him.
You done? Am I done?
The fact that Bill survives the encounter likely owes to the fact that he and Joel are on good terms. Finally, on a similar note, we collaborate with our captor rather than kill him as Joel and Tess had killed the Boston soldiers. So through the structure of image preparation and revision, The Last of Us signals how Bill's government differs from Boston's. The game presents a familiar scenario, so we understand by analogy that we're witnessing the ground rules for power and control in this context. However, Bill does not have the level of technology or organization that Boston does. We see the weakness of operating solo straight off. As well, ending the scene with collaboration rather than a standoff points to the introduction of an economy of trading favors that we discussed in the last video.
But after this, I owe you nothing.
His use of the same strong-arm approach fails precisely because no one has his back. Therefore, he manages his property using guile and traps.
Jesus!
See that wire? Stay underneath it, okay? Just keep your head low and you'll be fine.
All right. I got you.
Damn it, Bill!
The structure of image preparation and revision allows us to compare Bill's hands-on approach to control
Ow! Stop! Son of a bitch!
with his hands-off approach through his knack for traps.
Jesus!
This demonstrates to us that, in contrast with Boston, Bill maintains control best in his absence. And absence very much defines Bill's way of life, given the loss of his partner, Frank. Now, I'd like to recall our purpose in examining all this. By comparing Bill's and Boston's governments, we aren't comparing them here according to which works better for controlling a domain. We are considering how the game thematically reflects upon the human condition by portraying the various interpretations of power after societal collapse.
They're getting through! Keep going, this way!
Bill's town is a lone survivalist's interpretation, and not entirely by Bill's choice. Our examination of how Bill controls his domain is incomplete without also looking at his lost relationship with Frank.
Look, Bill, about your buddy back there, that's a tough deal. And
Looking at that relationship better fits under the theme of family, though, so we leave Bill's town here, incomplete for now. Now let's look at the hunters in Pittsburgh. The Last of Us does something very important in the hunter's government that's invisible if you're playing through the game quickly, merely fighting to make it to the next cutscene. Which I grant is a lot of fun. Beyond the action, though, The Last of Us is an adventure game, which requires exploration, discovery, and reflection upon details in the environment. This, I think, unlocks its full value. In this essay, we use these means to examine the history and meaning of Pittsburgh's government. So we'll review that history first. We'll consider how that history contributes to the game's thematic development. Finally, we'll look at the structural remixing from previous governments that goes into its presentation. Boston gives us some foreshadowing of the situation in Pittsburgh.
They fucking lynched him.
The entire squad?
Yeah. Way I heard it, they lined him up in the street and cut him up. Retribution and shit. We ever lose control of this place to the stragglers, that's what'll happen to us.
That would never go down here. Any straggler even looks at me the wrong way, I put his ass down.
I'm sure that's what they thought at every other QZ before riots broke out.
It's those goddamn fireflies. They keep stirring the population up. We put an end to them. That's how you solve this shit.
We agree on that.
We need to look at the beginning of the outbreak to see how things got this bad. Way back at the start of the outbreak, Pittsburgh and all the other quarantine zones enacted strict policies to prevent contamination within the zone. Those who failed the application process were dealt with forcefully.
Your fellow hunters do this?
Cute. And no, my money's on the military.
Why would they mow down all these people?
You can't let everyone in.
So they killed them?
And dead people don't get infected. You sacrifice the few to save the many.
During the years after the application period ended, the same exploitative relationship between Boston's military and civilian populations emerged in Pittsburgh.
Why wouldn't they give them their food?
Sometimes they ran out. Most times they just held on to it.
That never happened in Boston.
Trust me, it happened all the time.
Continuing the analogy between Boston's and Pittsburgh's military governments, similar strong-arm tactics were used to ensure order under military control.
Whoa, Nelly. Harsh punishment.
Shit, it ain't that much different than what the military does back in Boston.
I guess not.
We're not looking at the Pittsburgh military's work here, but Joel identifies this with Boston's military, which isn't that different from Pittsburgh's military when they were active, so we can infer a universal level of official abuse. Then, representatives from the Fireflies showed up to help organize protests and dissent. The Fireflies appear to have had a lesser presence in Pittsburgh than in Boston. In the graffiti that we discover, for example, we do not see any of the Firefly spray paint tags that we saw in Boston. However, we see plenty of communication from the civilians to the military. This implies that the Fireflies were the instigators of, but not the leaders of, this revolution. The military communicated back to the civilians using the same strong arm of public demonstration that we saw in Boston. Here is another instance of image preparation and revision. Marlene's wanted poster was image preparation for this poster portraying executed protesters. Again, we see ironic reversals and escalations. Marlene is the head figure of the Fireflies, whereas these protesters are anonymous. Marlene's face is clear and defined. These guys' faces are stamped over. As well, importantly, Marlene is still at large, whereas these protesters' stories are done. Let's get back to the timeline. According to documents found elsewhere in Pittsburgh, civilian dissent included nonviolent protests. In this mother's note, for example, we pick up from context that her son had been shot during a protest apart from the violent rebels whom she joins in response to her son's death. The military's strong-arm response to protesters radicalized the populace, as this document illustrates.
With that kind of thinking, no one wins.
Unfortunately for the Pittsburgh military, the civilians disagreed, and their responses became more consistently violent.
Man. You gotta be crazy to string up soldiers.
You get people desperate enough, they'll do just about anything.
And the people that rose up, they're the ones we've been fighting here?
That'd be my bet.
This kicked off a battle of attrition that lasted quite some time. Documents penned by military hands reveal two things. First, their contempt for civilians. Second, their disbelief that the military is actually losing. We see these losses reflected in the military's tactical maps. The fighting effectively closed off communications between the Pittsburgh quarantine zone and all others, as we see here in this letter that never made it to Atlanta. This document refers to 14 months of fighting. The protests and backlash violence continued for over a year. We see Mastros's desperation reflected on the revolutionaries' end as well. Mastros' note likely coincides with the revolutionaries' final push for victory. Note that the revolutionaries demand absolute loyalty and allegiance from fellow civilians. This is where Pittsburgh's governmental history becomes thematically fascinating to me. We already see hints that the tactics that radicalized civilians into revolutionaries, such as public executions as warnings against challenging authority, are on the table as punitive measures against dissent. The revolutionaries are enacting the very governmental policies that they despised. And when the revolutionaries hit, they hit hard, as we see from a note left by one of Mastros' subordinates who escaped the riot. We read here that Mastros was bound, doused with gasoline, and burned alive. An ironic fate, given that Mastros had requested permission to acknowledge defeat in that letter that was never delivered. Given how close this note is to this pile of bodies, and given the general positioning of the corpses, these are likely the remains of Mastros and the others whom that author vowed to avenge. Assuming that this is the location of the final battle, the revolutionaries leveled heavy damage on the military's resources. None of these tanks are in movable shape anyway. However, the revolutionaries were able to restore a Humvee with a mounted .50 caliber turret. We run into this vehicle several times as Joel and Ellie move through Pittsburgh.
We're okay. They can't see us.
It's bad news every time. Shortly after the dust has settled and the residents are no longer revolutionaries but in control of their community, they have to deal with their first public trial. Some teenagers killed other survivors who had wandered into Pittsburgh. These actions were lauded as an example that others would be forced to follow. Those who expressed dissent were handled with the same strong-arm tactics that the military would have used. Whatever moral code had been fought for was easily discarded in favor of a new law. Each member of the community must hunt other survivors in order to remain part of the community. The main difference between the new Pittsburgh and Pittsburgh under military control, I think, is the absence of clear organization. The new government certainly does not accommodate human dignity or individual freedom. If we take Boston as an example of how military governments run quarantine zones, civilians are exploited to scavenge for resources.
Wait, are you serious?
I got served the damn papers this morning. I've been selected for outside work duty.
In Pittsburgh, the civilians protested and overthrew the military government that exploited them. And we've come full circle. Pittsburgh's new, anonymous leaders demand similar acts of exploitation as part of the contract between individual and community, to the point of violating personal conscience. As one final step toward assuring their sovereignty, Pittsburgh's revolutionaries eliminated the Fireflies as military replacements, or even as allies. This removal appears not to have gone well for the Fireflies' representatives. It does, however, show how Pittsburgh's new government happily abuses the power that they revolted against under military rule. Now comes the big question. So what? How does this pieced-together backstory contribute to the game's thematic concerns? Well, the game falls into the post-apocalyptic genre, and the redistribution or reclamation of power is often a thematic concern of that genre. The Last of Us uses its American context to respond to that concern. The Pittsburgh scenario is premised upon a story deeply ingrained in the American mythos. The common citizens fight the good fight against a detached, tyrannical overclass who extol more than the citizens can bear. This association may be more intuitive for American players. The Last of Us is, among many other things, a game about America. As an American myself, I identify the Pittsburgh setup as a reflection of my country's own myth of origin, the Revolutionary War for independence from the British Empire. So we expect this feel-good narrative of overthrown tyranny. We see the beginning of that story's development, but The Last of Us subverts expectations by giving us an ending very different from that of the origin myth of American independence, which is the chartering of a rational government. As the trial note shows, Pittsburgh's revolutionaries have merely swapped burdens. But this time is different. This time there's no coordinated backlash. Pittsburgh has liberated itself into a new kind of bondage, one that its citizens adopt as their identity and do not resist. Whatever ideology of personal dignity fueled the revolution has given way to a newer, harsher worldview.
If you haven't noticed, they don't keep kids around. Survival of the fittest. Ugh.
And it's implied that over time, Pittsburgh's new masters prey upon outside survivors and even their own, until, finally, they have become the clannish hunters who ambushed Joel and Ellie. The hunters lack an organized system of justice or even the ideology that would result in a legal system. In this conversation, for example, the speaker implies that theft is okay as long as the thief doesn't get caught.
Yeah, that's all I should have known better. If you're gonna steal, you better make sure you get away with it. Right? I would have done.
The hunters have a boss or a series of bosses whom we do not meet. It's significant, I think, that we never meet these bosses. In part, it associates the hunter's exploitation of its members with the exploitation found in the military, whose leaders we also do not meet. There's also an abstract political element at play beyond that. Leadership after revolution is a social idea that implies that a group is being led in the community's best interest. Leadership implies the maintenance of ideals that bind and define the community. This does not emerge in Pittsburgh. It doesn't matter who's running the show.
New head honcho. Same bullshit talk.
Well, I don't know. Now that we have enough people watching all the exits, he says we can set up a larger perimeter.
What is that really gonna give us?
I don't know. Maybe we find some gas, get some more generators going. I'd really like to restore one of those old projectors, watch some movies or something.
That shit ain't happening. I've heard that expansion talk way too many times, and every time we try, it ends up with a bunch of us getting killed.
How do you know? Maybe things will be different now.
Keep your expectations in check, young'un. You'll live longer.
Only power itself matters, and power in the raw has no face. The nearest the hunters have to a sense of identity is their power for self-determination. They exist to exist. They exercise power to show that they can exercise power. In one sense, it's a continual assertion of the political revolution that we've chronicled. So that's where I think the governmental background of Pittsburgh is thematically significant. The Last of Us summons and undermines the expectations of the American myth of a just revolution. Political power is a necessary component of human existence, but without coordinating or organizing that power, in other words, without establishing a rational government, it becomes vain and destructive. We've given Pittsburgh's story so much attention for a crucial reason. A structural analysis relates structure to content, and many players overlook those documents whose contents are crucial to understanding that story. We need a foundation of shared knowledge about the story so we can assess how it's reflected through structure. Now that we've finished reviewing Pittsburgh through reading its documents and drawing inferences from its environment, we can see how The Last of Us uses structure to correlate Pittsburgh's government to the other governments presented thus far. When we moved from Boston to Billstown,
Tired of this shit.
We saw image preparation and revision at work.
Anything sprouting? Oh, God damn it, I'm clean!
Now, in Pittsburgh, we're seeing both revision and our third structuring element in effect, remixing, or putting familiar elements into new contexts. We've already discussed some of the overlap in imagery between Boston and Pittsburgh, mainly the imagery that correlates the hunters with the military government that they despised. Yet we still have some correlations left untouched. First up, we have the visual references of hunted bodies left in the streets. The Boston military hunted the Fireflies and left the corpses in the street to rot. Leaving the bodies of your enemies in the open for all to behold is a political action. It reminds everyone who's in charge.
God damn it, they got Warren.
They'll get body bags for civilians that they've put down.
We're through here. Gonna need 2 bags and 2 more for the box.
But they leave the Firefly corpses to the elements. The hunters discriminate much less. They leave the bodies of their political enemies and their anonymous quarry alike in the open. When they do dispose of bodies, that disposal appears recreational rather than for ritualistic purposes or even public sanitation. There are other associative repetitions of Boston and Pittsburgh that identify the hunters with their enemies. In Boston, Joel eavesdrops and overhears about the public execution of Fireflies.
I lined them up against the wall and bang, bang, bang. They just executed all of them.
And in Pittsburgh, we encounter the remains of quarantine zone military disposed of in the same manner. We also see the success of the Fireflies' attempts at inciting insurrection reversed. As noted earlier, we see a lot of Firefly tags in Boston, yet the Boston citizens remain docile and well kept, despite the fact that the Fireflies have given so much attention to inciting insurrection in Boston that their leader is on site.
Look, let's go find a Firefly.
We won't have to look very far.
There you go. Queen Firefly.
Compare this to Pittsburgh, where we see the remains of only 3 Fireflies, none of them mentioned as having high rank in this letter. And in contrast to Boston, this small group successfully incited insurrection. Again, we find the same element revised with ironic reversals. All of these revisions to Boston's scenario show us that the same post-pandemic elements can lead to different conclusions. By reflecting and expressing the content of Pittsburgh's story in this structure, The Last of Us reveals the variety in its human ecology. To a lesser degree, Pittsburgh also revises elements from the smugglers' government. Like the smugglers, they dress in scavenge clothing and fight improvisationally.
Fuck.
Yet the smugglers fight because they're hired hands.
Jesus. We shouldn't have taken this job.
Not our call.
By contrast, the hunters are deliberately banded together, and they've chosen for themselves to attack other survivors.
I pray to God these tours show their faces. Fuck, they gotta show up somewhere. Maybe this will be your lucky day.
The smugglers acknowledge their reluctance while the hunters are just brimming with enthusiasm. Finally, there are the matters of leadership and maintenance. Tess notes that Robert's smuggling empire is based upon charisma and empty promises.
How the hell did he get all these guys?
If Robert's good at one thing, it's writing blank checks. Let's go put an end to that.
We actually hear a similar complaint about the hunter's boss's leadership while eavesdropping.
New head honcho. Same bullshit talk.
That same conversation shows that their government's power is limited to maintaining their territory.
I've heard that expansion talk way too many times, and every time we try, it ends up with a bunch of us getting killed.
And that fact alone to me is hilarious. Finally, we get elements from Billstown. The most obvious reference is the idea of turf, or regional control. Bill puts up several warnings against trespassing, and the hunters verbally announce that this is their turf once Joel and his group arrive at the suburbs.
This ain't your turf, man!
As if we hadn't already picked up on that. When Pittsburgh revises the image of turf prepared for us in Billstown, we see a major ironic reversal. Bill wants to keep people out of his territory, whereas the hunters want to lure people into their territory in order to prey upon them. Along those same lines, The Last of Us also remixes the image of traps in Pittsburgh by placing a known element in a new context. We first learn about traps in Billstown, and we receive this information in a kind of tutorial format.
See that wire? Stay underneath it, okay? Just keep your head low and you'll be fine.
All right.
It never really returns as a consequential element in Billstown.
Oh, shit. Those things are kind of awesome.
That's one way to do it.
As discussed earlier, Bill's governance works best in his absence since he takes care of his territory alone. Therefore, his traps are kind of a stand-in for his authority. The nail bomb tripwire trap reappears later in Pittsburgh. This time, however, it serves a dual purpose. It'll blow you up, and it works as an alarm. We learned how to trigger these traps from a safe distance in Billstown, but that knowledge betrays us here by drawing the attention of hidden enemies to Joel's location. This is part of the structure of The Last of Us. The game remixes this element by putting it into a different context. I think the way The Last of Us remixes the tripwire trap is really neat, so let's digress a bit to see how this works. We'll start by looking at enemy placement. Two of the enemies who throw projectile Molotovs patrol the balcony that overlooks the alley. They work as sentries, but they're more dangerous as projectile-throwing enemies once you've been caught. More dangerous, though, is the cluster of enemies hidden in the areas around this No Hope graffiti. They've got a handful of riflemen down there, so they're prepared to engage Joel if he reveals his position to the Molotov guys upstairs. So we've got three ways that we can reveal Joel's position. First, set off the traps. Second, get seen by running down the middle of the street to the end. Third, attack the enemies head-on. We're going to take the third option off the table since that's just dumb. For stealth purposes, at least. We might run down the middle of the street in plain sight because the traps are positioned to direct traffic away from the side routes. We have these two traps preventing us from entering the bookstore. And we have this trap between the police car and the wall that prevents us from sneaking underneath the second floor's patrol site. It's easy enough to go around, but it's still a risk. So if you don't want to set up the bombs, this flushes Joel down the center of the street. This remixes the use of the bombs in Billstown, where they were used as deterrents rather than part of a larger trap. There is a way to the second floor of the burned-out building, though. This access allows us to use the remixing to our advantage. First, we climb up to the second floor and take out the three guys stealthily. Then we use the bow and arrow to set off one of the bookstore explosives. This puts the guards at the end of the street on alert, effectively flushing them out of their ambushed locations. Equipping a lethal weapon, though, will draw their attention, which is why they're firing at Joel here. But if you keep a low-profile weapon like the bow equipped, you can watch the troops at the end of the street reveal their positions, and you can watch them check the source of the noise. You can use the bow and arrow to take out the melee guy while he has his back turned to you. The bow and arrow is not a guaranteed one-hit kill on Survivor difficulty, so attacking him actually revealed my position. This is not a serious problem, though. We have a high position and are therefore at a strong advantage. Flushing them out turns the tables almost directly. They intended to use the level design against Joel, but by taking advantage of the remixed use of the tripwire traps, we can use the level design against the hunters. That's one of the more nuanced ways that a structure of remixing can affect the gameplay experience, but our focus here is thematic. This interactive remixing shows us how the same tool, in this case the nail bomb traps, can be used for very different moral ends. It expands our sense of the post-pandemic human ecology. The structural correlation between Billstown and Pittsburgh reinforces the game's theme. And that theme is the variety of human ecologies that emerge when we must reconstruct after societal collapse. The game occurs in a science fiction context, but The Last of Us is, in part, about how we coordinate ourselves with ourselves on a variety of social scales, resulting in a variety of human ecologies. By revising and remixing significant elements from Boston, the smugglers community, and Billstown, Pittsburgh is familiar yet strange, understandable yet surprising, because it follows the structure that we've examined throughout this video series, starting with the game's interactive design. There's much more to discuss, and we will get to it. In order to keep these videos at watchable lengths, and in order to give each topic the attention it deserves, we're going to take a break here. Next time, we'll pick up with the government from David's camp and move forward from there. Thank you for watching.